A rifle barrel rests against the rough gray bark of a towering oak tree. A finger tightens on a curved brass trigger in the crisp October air. A British general sits high in his saddle, his gold-laced coat gleaming against the forest gloom. A single crack of gunfire shatters the organized silence of the battlefield. The officer's horse rears back, its hooves kicking at the churned mud. A second shot rings out, and the general topples backward into the grass. The command structure of an entire empire begins to dissolve in the dirt. The date was October 7, 1777. The location was the dense wooded slope of Bemis Heights in upstate New York. Brigadier General Simon Fraser rode among his wavering infantry lines. He shouted commands to rally the British soldiers against the encroaching American threat. Colonel Daniel Morgan watched the scene from the shadows of the tree line. He commanded 500 hand-picked marksmen trained for this specific, brutal purpose. He gestured toward the group of mounted officers gathered near the British flank. Timothy Murphy climbed into the branches of an elevated position overlooking the clearing. He leveled his Pennsylvania long rifle at the shimmering gold lace of the British commander. He adjusted his aim to compensate for the distance and the wind. The first shot struck the leather pommel of General Fraser's saddle with a sharp snap. The general paused, confused by the sudden impact. Murphy worked the mechanism of his rifle with practiced, rhythmic efficiency. He fired the second shot before the British soldiers could locate the source of the danger. The lead ball struck the general in the abdomen. Simon Fraser slumped over his horse's neck as the animal bolted toward the rear lines. The sight of their most respected leader falling triggered a wave of panic through the British ranks. British soldiers viewed the battlefield through the rigid lens of 18th-century gentlemanly warfare. Officers stood apart from the common rank and file, marked by their status and their dress. They expected to engage in honorable, face-to-face volleys at close range. The American tactic of selecting leaders for death from the safety of the woods defied every rule of the era. British command considered the practice an act of cowardice rather than a military maneuver. They found no honor in being hunted by invisible men from the shadows. General John Burgoyne relied on the steady resolve of his second-in-command to maintain the order of his expeditionary force. Simon Fraser served as the soul of that army. His sudden removal from the field created a vacuum of leadership that no other officer could fill. The British flank at Bemis Heights began to crumble as the news of the general's wounding spread. Soldiers who had stood firm against cannon fire now broke and retreated into the tangled brush. The American riflemen did not pursue them with bayonets, but continued their systematic fire. Every officer wearing a distinct sash or ornate uniform became a primary target. The American marksmen dismantled the British command structure one man at a time. The chaotic retreat marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict. The engagement on October 7th was the final turning point for the Northern Expeditionary Force. General Fraser died from his wounds on the following day, October 8th. His death removed the primary obstacle to the total collapse of the British position. General Burgoyne looked toward the road back to Saratoga as his force disintegrated. He realized that the campaign, once full of promise, had stalled in the wilderness. The American rifleman had effectively paralyzed his ability to coordinate his remaining 5,800 troops. The tactical reality of the battlefield had changed permanently. The high-ranking gentlemen of the British Army were no longer safe behind their lines. The era of the hidden marksman had arrived, and with it, the beginning of the end for the British hold on the northern colonies. A heavy, iron-bound crate sits on the damp forest floor. A soldier pries it open with a steel crowbar. Inside lay the standard-issue Brown Bess muskets of the British infantry. The weapon features a wide, smooth barrel measuring .75 caliber. It lacks any internal grooves to guide the lead projectile. The musket relies on a simple, forceful explosion to launch a heavy ball. A British sergeant demonstrates the loading procedure on the parade ground. He pours black powder down the muzzle with a measured flick of his wrist. He rams the lead ball home with a wooden rod. The weapon is designed for rapid, massed volleys. Soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder in tight, rigid lines. They fire at the enemy in a wall of lead. Accuracy remains a secondary concern for the British command. The smooth-bore barrel causes the ball to bounce unpredictably against the sides. The effective range terminates at roughly 50 to 100 yards. A Pennsylvania long rifle rests on a wooden bench nearby. Its barrel is significantly longer than the Brown Bess. Thin, spiral grooves cut deep into the interior steel. These grooves force the lead ball to rotate during its flight. The spin stabilizes the projectile in the air. This mechanical process is known as rifling. Colonel Daniel Morgan inspects the weapons of his 500-man rifle corps. He favors this specialized equipment for his marksmen. The long rifle achieves lethal accuracy out to 300 yards. The rifleman carefully pours a precise measure of powder into the pan. He wraps his lead ball in a small patch of greased linen. This patch ensures a tight seal against the rifling grooves. The soldier pushes the ball down the barrel with a metal rod. It requires more time and effort than the British musket. The trade-off is distance and precision. Morgan's men occupy the dense woods surrounding the British positions. They blend into the shadows of the ancient oak trees. The British troops remain visible in their bright red coats. The Americans view the battlefield through the clear sights of their long rifles. They select their targets from a range that the British cannot return. The British musket balls fall harmlessly into the dirt long before reaching the tree line. A British officer paces his line of infantry. He assumes he is safe from the distant American skirmishers. He does not account for the reach of the Pennsylvania rifle. The American rifleman breathes slowly and settles his aim. He ignores the mass of common soldiers. He focuses his sight on the gold braid of the officer's uniform. The rifle discharges with a sharp, piercing crack. The officer falls before his men even hear the report. The distance between the two armies has become a lethal trap for the British leadership. Morgan's 500 riflemen dictate the tempo of the engagement. They move through the undergrowth with fluid, individual movements. They never stand in the vulnerable lines of traditional European warfare. The British force struggles to adapt to this new reality. Their doctrine demands a direct, head-on confrontation. They cannot engage an enemy they can barely see. The technological gap creates a mounting crisis for General John Burgoyne. His infantry units are pinned down by invisible fire. His officers are dismantled from hundreds of yards away. The American Rifle Corps controls the space between the armies. They possess the range to dictate where the British may stand. The battlefield has become a hunting ground. The British command watches their ranks thin under the persistent pressure. They remain tethered to the constraints of the smoothbore musket. The era of the rifle has effectively begun on the slopes of Saratoga. The date was September 19, 1777. The setting was a clearing known as Freeman's Farm in upstate New York. Colonel Daniel Morgan positioned his 500 riflemen among the dense trees bordering the field. The British soldiers marched into the open space in their traditional lines. Their bright red coats offered a stark contrast against the green forest canopy. The American riflemen remained hidden in the deep shadows of the woods. The British officers rode on horseback to direct their infantry units. They wore gold-laced uniforms and distinct silk sashes that identified their rank. Morgan issued a clear, direct order to his marksmen. He commanded them to ignore the common infantrymen in the ranks. He directed their fire toward the men in the ornate uniforms. The American long rifles sparked with a sharp, heavy report. The lead balls traveled across the open field with high velocity. British officers fell from their saddles before their units could form a proper defensive wall. The British command structure began to fracture under the unrelenting pressure. Confusion spread through the British ranks as their leaders disappeared, one by one. The American riflemen maintained a steady, systematic pace of fire. They reloaded their specialized weapons with deliberate, practiced movements. The British infantry attempted to return fire with their smoothbore muskets. Their balls struck the trunks of the trees far short of the American positions. The British soldiers struggled to identify the source of the lethal projectiles. They fired into the empty trees while their officers continued to drop. The fighting lasted for hours as the British forces attempted to advance. The American riflemen moved through the undergrowth to maintain their advantage. They shifted their positions to keep the British officers in their sights. By the end of the day, the field was littered with British casualties. General John Burgoyne lost roughly 600 men during the engagement at Freeman's Farm. The American forces recorded approximately 300 casualties in the same period. The disparity in leadership losses proved devastating for the British Northern Expeditionary Force. The surviving officers could not coordinate their units without clear guidance. The British Army remained stalled and leaderless on the edge of the farm. The tactical reliance on officer-led formations became a fatal liability. The American Rifle Corps had successfully dismantled the hierarchy of the opposing army. The engagement at Freeman's Farm redefined the standard of combat for the campaign. The British command realized they were fighting a new and unfamiliar type of adversary. The woods had become an extension of the American weapon system. The British Army retreated to their fortified lines as the sun began to set. The strategic initiative had shifted firmly into the hands of the American commanders. The loss of leadership on September 19th left the British force vulnerable. The stage was now set for the final confrontation at Bemis Heights. The British officers stood on the field in their finest uniforms. They wore silk sashes and gold-laced coats to signal their status. They expected a battle fought in the tradition of European gentlemen. They anticipated a contest of honor and rigid formation. The American riflemen watched from the deep shadows of the forest. They cared nothing for the rules of 18th-century combat. They aimed their long barrels at the men commanding the lines. The British command viewed this behavior as a profound violation of military ethics. General John Burgoyne observed the mounting chaos within his ranks. He witnessed his most experienced officers falling without a fight. He regarded the American tactic as a cowardly departure from civilized warfare. He considered the targeting of leadership a breach of professional conduct. The British soldiers expressed open outrage at the American methods. They labeled the riflemen as murderers hiding in the brush. They believed that a true soldier fought face-to-face in the open field. They found no honor in being picked off by an unseen enemy. The American Rifle Corps operated under a different set of priorities. Colonel Daniel Morgan prioritized the destruction of the opposing command structure. He instructed his marksmen to ignore the common infantry soldiers. He demanded the systematic elimination of the men who gave the orders. The clash of these two philosophies signaled a fundamental shift in warfare. The British clung to the standard of the formal line-of-battle engagement. The Americans embraced the efficiency of total attrition-based conflict. The battlefield transformed from a stage of honor into a site of cold survival. British officers walked their lines and found themselves under constant lethal threat. They could no longer direct their men without risking an immediate death. The gold lace on their uniforms acted as a beacon for the American marksmen. The very symbols of their authority became the instruments of their destruction. The American riflemen moved silently through the dense New York undergrowth. They refused to stand in the vulnerable lines of traditional combat. They utilized the terrain to turn the British doctrine against itself. The British Army possessed no mechanism to counter this asymmetric pressure. The British command perceived this change as a decay of the soldierly spirit. They argued that warfare required a clear, mutual agreement on the rules of engagement. They saw the American reliance on long-range sniping as a sign of weakness. They struggled to adapt to a reality where their rank offered no protection. The transition to attrition-based warfare became permanent on the slopes of Saratoga. The American riflemen dismantled the hierarchy of the British Northern Expeditionary Force. They proved that a professional army could be defeated by targeting its nervous system. The era of the gentleman soldier withered under the fire of the Pennsylvania rifle. General Simon Fraser slumped over the neck of his horse. The ball from the Pennsylvania rifle had struck him deep in the abdomen. His aides rushed forward to catch him before he fell to the blood-stained grass. They carried the wounded general away from the chaotic front line at Bemis Heights. The British soldiers watched their leader disappear into the rear. A profound silence descended upon the ranks of the British flank. The soldiers felt the sudden void left by their most respected commander. General Simon Fraser arrived at a makeshift medical tent behind the lines. Surgeons examined the deep, jagged wound caused by the heavy lead projectile. They recognized the lethality of the damage inflicted by the rifleman. The general remained conscious while the doctors worked to stem the internal bleeding. He knew his life was slipping away amidst the noise of the ongoing battle. He spoke to his subordinates about the deteriorating state of the British position. He expressed his final wishes as the evening light faded from the tent. His command staff stood around him in the dim, flickering candlelight. The British army outside the tent began to lose its cohesion. The loss of the soul of the army paralyzed the remaining officers. General John Burgoyne received word of his second-in-command's critical condition. He realized the strategic disaster unfolding on the edge of the camp. The British flank, once anchored by Fraser's presence, began to crumble under pressure. General Simon Fraser died from his wounds on the morning of October 8, 1777. His death left the British Northern Expeditionary Force without its primary tactical guide. The remaining officers failed to coordinate a unified response to the American pressure. The British soldiers retreated from their positions as their morale evaporated. General John Burgoyne witnessed the slow dissolution of his battle-hardened units. The strategic initiative shifted decisively toward Major General Horatio Gates. The collapse of the British flank forced a desperate withdrawal toward Saratoga. The loss of General Fraser transformed a tactical retreat into an inevitable defeat. The British Army moved north with the heavy burden of their commander's death. The American Rifle Corps continued to press their advantage in the dense woods. The British command structure possessed no remaining mechanism to stabilize the front. The entire expeditionary force drifted toward the final confrontation at Saratoga. The death of one man had dismantled the leadership of an entire empire. The tactical reality of the battlefield had changed forever. What remained of the British Army waited for the end in the fields of Saratoga. The British Army trudged north through the autumn rain of 1777. Mud clung to the woolen uniforms of the exhausted infantrymen. General John Burgoyne led his broken column toward the village of Saratoga. The once proud Northern Expeditionary Force now resembled a funeral procession. Wagons creaked under the weight of the wounded and the dying. The soldiers abandoned heavy artillery pieces in the thickening mire. American forces shadowed every move from the surrounding ridgelines. Major General Horatio Gates tightened the net around the retreating British. The British soldiers reached the banks of the Hudson River on October 13th. They found themselves completely surrounded by the Continental Army. General John Burgoyne convened a final council of war with his officers. The officers surveyed the dwindling supplies of flour and salt pork. They looked at the thousands of tired men capable of holding a musket. The reality of the strategic failure settled over the British encampment. Burgoyne signed the terms of surrender on October 17, 1777. The British troops marched out to the field of surrender at Saratoga. They stacked their muskets in long, silent rows upon the ground. Major General Horatio Gates accepted the formal submission of the army. 5,800 British soldiers laid down their arms before the American victors. The surrender marked the definitive end of the Northern Expedition. Historians like Christopher Hibbert and Richard Ketchum studied the aftermath. They observed a permanent shift in the evolution of military engagement. The tactical success of the riflemen redefined the limits of command. The deliberate targeting of officers became the bedrock of modern sniper doctrine. The age of the gentleman soldier dissolved in the woods of New York. The rifle had permanently erased the safety of the officer's rank. You walk through the quiet woods now, but the distance between you and the tree line feels wrong. The rules have changed, and the scope is already fixed on the gold lace of your authority. You are the target, and the cycle never actually stopped.